Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester, where we are holding the next session of the Bilingualism series. The director cannot be here with us today, so I will introduce both the program, which many of you are already familiar with, and also our speaker, Itxaso Rodríguez-Ordóñez. So welcome back to this cycle, and welcome in particular to the last talk of the third edition, the 2023 edition of the Bilingualism series of the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds. As you know, the purpose of this series is to bring together a number of scholars, experts on different subtopics within the realm of bilingualism and multilingualism. The importance of bilingualism and multilingualism at present cannot be underestimated. In particular, the benefits that speaking more than one language brings to individuals and to society at large are undeniable. And of course, the goal is to make the talks, the information arising from the talks, rather accessible to a general audience. To this end, one thing we do is to record the talks and make them available on YouTube, okay? So they can be there for days on end for the future. So today we concentrate on a topic that has not been touched upon so far, namely new minority speakers, with special attention to speakers of Basque, a language spoken in the Basque region in the northeastern part of Spain. It's therefore a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Itxaso Rodríguez-Ordóñez, who is assistant professor at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Rodríguez-Ordóñez undertook an English studies degree at Deusto in Spain back in 2009, and then went on to take MA and PhD degrees from Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the United States. She completed her doctoral degree in 2016. She's a variationist social linguist whose focus is on language contact situations, especially Basque Spanish in Spain, as well as English Spanish in the United States. On completion of her PhD, Itxaso taught at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, for a few years before relocating to California, where she currently resides. Itxaso is published widely in reputable journals and outlets, including, but not limited to, the International Journal of Bilingualism, Applied Psycholinguistics, Journal of Language Contact, Journal of Social Linguistics, and the Cambridge Handbook of Heritage Languages and Linguistics. Anyway, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Itxaso. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Julio, for the invitation and also for such a great introduction. For me, it's an honor to be here to talk a little bit about my language and also a little bit of my research. And also to be participating part in the Cervantes series, because I myself spent some time in the region of Manchester. I went to University of Leeds for my Erasmus, and I have very fond memories of that. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to start by letting you know that this research that I started during my PhD and, well, master's and PhD or doctoral program kind of was informed particularly by my life in a way, right? So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what new speakers are. I myself do not consider myself a new speaker, but my parents are new speakers. They learned Basque as adults after the dictatorship ended, and they made my sister and I actually native, or in a way, that's the language that we spoke at home. But that also came with certain challenges. So for my research, for instance, this is something that I would like to document, to describe. So in a way, it's also a story of my life and the people around me. So that's something that I wanted to clarify. So I want to start by sharing some examples of what new speakers might actually feel when they're learning a new language that is considered minoritized. And then we'll talk a little bit about what minoritized is. So over here, we have Sian, who is a new speaker of Irish. And over here, this person is saying, I would prefer to learn from the native speaker, you know. I wouldn't like to learn from the learners because you're going to make the same mistakes, perhaps. If we want to learn Irish, we will go to the well of nativeness and the Gaeltach and go to the native speakers. So over here, you can see that for Sian, it's very, very, very important that you sound from somewhere when learning Irish. And that Irishness is coming from the Irish-speaking region, which in Ireland is called Gaeltacht. However, there are other people like Polly, who is a new speaker of Scottish Gaelic, who says that she doesn't need to actually sound from somewhere. Over here, she says, I could have learned a Lewis accent maybe, but I haven't been. The thing I felt was, well, I've never been to Lewis. Why would I have a Lewis accent? That would be really strange. Why would I have a Northeast accent? I've never been there. So one of the things that we see here is the opposition of actually sounding potentially native, and that nativeness comes from the region in which people speak the variety natively. For her, claiming some kind of a speakerhood in Scottish Gaelic is removed from that idea of the origin of some sort. So what is interesting is that these speakers are bringing the question of when you're learning a new variety or a new language, especially that is minoritized, which variety do you pick, why, and for what purposes? In the case of Basque, for instance, Aitzol, who is considered also a new speaker of Basque, is very aware of what happens in a situation of minority language revitalization, especially with bilingualism. Over here, she states, those who come from Badua background or standard Basque background, meaning that they learned Basque at home, will have the habit to say it all in Basque, even if it's artificial. But for instance, native speakers or Euskaldun Zaharrak, if Basque doesn't come to them, they say it in Spanish, very natural, and they go back to Basque without realizing about it. But those who speak a standard, you do that and tell you, you speak so badly. So over here, Aitzol is telling us that being bilingual also comes with consequences of something not natural, artificial, or some sort of, that, for instance, the linguistic practices of bilinguals are not going to be judged in the same way, depending on the kind of speaker that you're being seen. So this also raises the question of what does it mean to be a speaker of a new language, and also especially if that language is minoritized and so sort. So in this talk, what I wanted to be asked, one of the things that I want to address is, in fact, to describe what does it mean to be a new speaker of minoritized languages. Why are these speakers important to understand, especially for revitalization processes? And then I'm going to focus the remaining of the talk with some of the research on Basque that I have done that could potentially address some of the complex paradoxes that appear in language revitalization contexts. So let's start zooming out a little bit. So the 21st century has been considered the century of linguistic diversity. Some people have also called it the multilingual turn. What does this mean? It means that the linguistic diversity, so people have become aware that this linguistic diversity has to be somehow protected. Of course, this is not new, but the awareness behind it is becoming a lot more stringent, in the sense that some statistics have been going on for a long time. We know that there are about 7,000 languages that we know of, at least that are oral or spoken languages, and only 90 of those are going to be officially written. There is an estimation as well that, for instance, nearly half of those languages may cease to be used in the next 100 years or so. So these statistics basically are calling us to revitalize some of the diversity that we still have, or we can also bring back that diversity that might have ceased to be used, and so forth. So, of course, this is not something that happened in this century, right? In the European context, we have two important instruments that have kind of promoted this diversity. The UNESCO, which was formed a long time ago in 1946 with the goal of promoting and securing human rights, and then there is a subsection of languages, and then a little more recently, and this was an important one, part of the Council of Europe to protect and promote regional minorities languages. Today, it is estimated that there are 400 minorities in Europe with about 125 spoken languages. So if you go into this map, which is interactive, you can actually click on all of these different languages that are and have been for a long time trying to revitalize and so forth. And all of them have the same status. We can also compare that to the context where I'm currently actually connecting from, which is the traditional lands of the Tomba. So if we look at what the United States and North America would be, the linguistic diversity is also massive. And there's a major language revitalization processes happening in this context, meaning that this is a global issue and so forth. So let's start talking a little bit about new speakers. This is a framework that is started actually in the European context by defining new speakers as individuals with little or no home or community exposure to a minority language, and who instead acquire through immersion or bilingual education programs, revitalization projects, or adults. How did the term emerge? Actually, many of our communities did have that census category. So in the Basque case, we have the word Euskaldun berriak, which means new speaker of Basque. In Gallego, we also have the same term, neofalante. And in new speakers of Breton are also be called neobretonal. So what happened is that these linguists started to discuss some issues that were happening around these areas of language revitalization with respect to authenticity and unauthenticity. And different communities started to use the word new speaker of some sort. So they started to think about, okay, we need a framework to be able to understand experiences, the diverse experiences such as Sia and Aitzol and also Poli, to understand how is that the language is being revitalizing. So when we look at new speakers, it's not only a connotation of the future. So over here, we see Misty Jaffe's temporal representation of language revitalization. So languages that have a lot of vitality, they are not necessarily needing any new speakers and so forth. But as that vitality fades because of language shift, some speakers sometimes might be considered semi-speakers, which means that they might not be able to speak the languages fluently or so forth. And then it could be that some languages might actually stop having speakers at all. Language revitalization interventions have created new speakers. And in fact, these are going to be considered the future of the speakers themselves. What is important to recognize is that in language revitalization processes, right, oftentimes, although these are considered the fruitful aspects of language revitalization, right, sometimes those revitalizations are based on a very romantic past. So what does it mean to bring the language back? In many, many, many cases, it has been believed that we want to go back to the romantic past that by looking at unchanged forms of speaking. In this respect, oftentimes new speakers are seen as clinical categorizations. This is the case of Sian, for instance, who wants to go to this very important past. Oftentimes, a lot of different terms have come out of this by saying, oh, you're a semi-speaker, you're a last speaker, you're a second language speaker, you're an imperfect speaker, you're a former speaker, you're a ghost speaker, and so forth, right? The assumption here is that if you don't speak the language natively, or if you don't speak it in a way that is done in the past, you are not going to be considered an authentic one or a good one, and so forth. So, however, social linguists have started to kind of question this idea of what it means to revive a language, right? And question the idea of the salvage linguistics. And instead, focusing that authenticity might not be the only way in which we can think about it, like romanticizing that view of the past, that we also have to adapt it to the actual conditions of the modern times. However, this revitalization context, there are going to be three contradictions and three paradoxes that we're going to have to deal with. The first one is that understanding that native speakers are legitimate because they're the ones that kept the language alive too. But understanding that second language speakers or new speakers are going to be necessary for us for the survival of these languages. The second one, we want to keep the language as authentic as possible, given that language contact is a reality in this context. But we also want to create modes of anonymity so that we can also expand the language to other kind of functions, or at least within the European context, right? This doesn't need to be this way. And finally, we also have ideas of purity. We want to keep the languages separate, but the reality is that we are both in a multilingual society, and many, if not all, speakers of minoritized languages are actually bilingual themselves. So language contact is going to be an inevitable outcome of these practices. So how do we navigate these contradictions in continuing the survival of the language? So the new speaker model, which was created about 10 years ago, right? Basically, they are challenging the native speaker models of language, which means that you don't have to be a native speaker to be able to be considered an authentic speaker. But obviously, these are things that are going to be negotiated, right? So this model kind of brings the questions of what does it mean to be a competent speaker of a minority language? Are the same standards applicable? If so, how are those standards practiced? Who decides what does it mean to be a competent speaker? And what ideological frameworks exist in, for instance, creating potential new identities or new practices and so forth? How are new variation also contributing to those practices. So in this respect, studying new speakers are going to bring important implications for language planning and for the language revitalization process. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the Basque language revitalization. So the Basque region is actually divided in 2 nation states, Spain and France, and then in 3 administrative units. So the Basque Autonomous Community, which is the 3 provinces over here, this is where Basque became co-official with the Spanish during the, after the dictatorship and when the democracy was established, right? At that time, in 1968, we had a new variety that was created. It's called Standard Basque. And this is the variety that is basically being used in the school system, thanks to the law of normalization. So I'll talk a little bit more about it. But the law of normalization basically tries to establish Basque as a normal language for Basque society. But because it's co-official with the Spanish, that means that they have to be coexisting together. So both languages will become normal. This is part of the Constitución Española. So over here, you will see that Article 3 basically says that the Spanish language is considered, or the Castilian language is considered the official language of the state. Every Spaniard has the duty to know it and the right to use it. The other Spanish languages would also be official in the respective communities, right? According to the estatus. This means that Basque is being granted officiality in the Basque Autonomous Community. However, Article number 6.1 actually says that the inhabitants of other communities, such as the Basque Autonomous Community, has the right to use the language. So while the Constitution is giving linguistic rights for the very first time of using these languages, right? Remember that these languages are still going to be situated within a minority status, given that Spanish is the obligation of all the Spaniards to be able to use it, right? So remember that speaking Basque is a right, knowing Spanish is a duty. So this is where the law of normalization comes into play. So the law of normalization that was established in 1982 basically is trying to elevate the status of having your rights basically being implemented. And how it's being done? Through the school. In the Basque country, it was done thanks to the standardization and putting Basque in the school system where bilingual schooling was the norm, right? And today, most of children are going to be educated both in Basque and Spanish. The law of normalization also establishes that you can have access to the language in the administration, in the law, at the university, in the radio, and so forth, meaning that the ideal is basically that you can live your life in a Basque way, should you want to. But at the same time, you should also have your Spanish rights there. So what does the law of normalization actually do? Well, once the standard Basque is created and then implemented in the school system, now we're starting to see a resurrection of societal bilingualism, meaning that younger populations are becoming bilingual, both in Spanish and Basque. So that means that the new makeup of the speakerhood of Basque is also changing. Whereas in 1991, all Basque, not all, but most Basque speakers were actually native speakers. Now in 2016, according to the last census, most of young people are actually considered new speakers, meaning that they learned Basque, especially through the education system. And it could be as early as 3 years old, 2 years old, or very, very, very young, or a little bit later, like my parents in their 20s, for instance, right? But over here, we see a very important shift in who is the Basque speaker in the Basque country. When we look at bilingual zones, obviously the normalization of Basque is not going to be equally in all areas. So different colors represent how much societal bilingualism exists. And you will notice that, for instance, the red and the yellow areas are going to be the most bilingual zones. These are considered traditional zones of Basque speaking, meaning that Basque was already spoken before the revitalization. Whereas the yellow and the green areas, these are considered lower bilingual zones, right? But these are the regions where Basque was almost lost, or at least not used. So what that means is that the revitalization has actually brought a presence of Basqueness, even albeit to a limited state, but in those areas. So over here, we're going to compare the language use. So even if language revitalization in the Basque case has been considered very successful, right, there's still some work to do because the use of Basque has not necessarily increased as much. Notice that today, almost 90% of the young children are actually bilingual with Basque and Spanish. But then depending on the zone, the language used outside of the classroom is actually very, very small depending on the zone. So, however, something positive that we're seeing is that in zones 1 and 2, the use of Basque is actually increasing steadily. Whereas in zone 4, which would be the most bilingual of all, language use is actually decreasing, right? So again, normalization does not necessarily magically create, there is still some work to do behind that. In fact, you probably read on the newspapers that there has been some potential attacks on the language, especially within the law, as to how to change whether these rights are being done or whether Spanish is being attacked and so forth, right? So all over here, you're going to see there's a lot of manifestations. You're going to be hearing quite some work about it. What is interesting is that some different laws has also been implemented, and this link over here is going to take you around which are the ones that has been contested in a way of using Basque. So for instance, there are certain articles, or at least here the Tribunal Constitucional is basically saying that Basque has been in a way replacing Spanish and so forth, right? So this actually brings new questions of what does language normalization actually mean, and what is success in language revitalization? Remember that from the very, very beginning, the status of Basque is already inferior to that of Castilian, even in the Basque country. So the research questions that I would like to answer for this talk is that what are some of the identities that Basque speakers have, right? And this is also linked to the language revitalization. How is the language revitalization and these new policies create new identities, and whether the grammar of Basque is also actually changing? And then how do people think about that with certain implications for language revitalization? So for that, I'm going to be talking about 3 different papers or projects that I did that all come from a corpus that I created myself when I did my dissertation. So I conducted interviews throughout different parts of the Basque country, especially from the Guernica area. This is where I come from myself, right? I also interviewed people from Bilbao, which is the major city of the entire Basque country, and then some interviews in the capital of the French Basque country in Bayonne. Today, I'm only going to be comparing those in Bilbao and Guernica. And you probably notice, and what is this line over here? This line represents the difference between traditional speaking zones, which is in Guernica, versus Bilbao, which is a non-traditionally Basque speaking. However, Basque is spoken now in the form of standard Basque. So what is interesting is that Guernica has its own regional variety, whereas Bilbao is starting to have its own regional variety thanks to the revitalization in a standard form with some kind of features from that area as well. But again, the idea is that you are more likely to hear a standard over there. What is important to know is that in Guernica, you also have the standard because it's implemented in the schools. So the social linguistic interviews that I did them in cafeterias, local people, but for the new speakers, these are 2 very important locations where Basque is actually taught for adults. So Zornotzako Barnetegia is a Basque school that is close, is actually between Guernica and Bilbao. And it's a boarding school where you can actually go there and live in Basque for the entire summer if you wanted to. You can also go in Bilbao, different schools. So for instance, Euskaltegi means a Basque school where you learn Basque. And underneath there is also a bar. And these 2 are actually connected. This is where a lot of the socialization happens. So during the summertime, there is a lot of intensive courses. Throughout the year, you can also take Basque courses. And these are designed to either get literacy in Basque for those who already know the language, or to write out, just learn the language. So my job was to hang out with them over the entire summer, spend time both in Barnetegia and also in Lizarde Euskaltegia. I will hang out in the classroom with them, but mainly outside of the classroom. This is where the interviews happen, through dinners and a lot of coffees and beer, basically. So let's start asking the question of how do people feel? How do they identify? And this is done by something called emergent participant self-identification category. So basically, a lot of speakers basically telling you how is it that they are orienting towards the Basque, what kind of identity they're giving to themselves. And here we have Sara, who considers herself a new speaker of Basque because, as she mentions, we started learning Basque at the age of 3 in school. What is interesting is that over here, the criteria of learning Basque at school is very important to identify somebody as a new speaker. When we go to Guernica, I asked Danny, for instance, we went to school together, and I was surprised that he didn't consider himself a native speaker. Even if I knew he spoke Basque very fluently, he also spoke the local variety. And instead, he said that he considered himself just a Basque speaker. So I asked him, really? So this is how the conversation starts. Do you feel traditional speaker or native speaker? He said, no. I said, no, my parents are Andalusian. Well, I don't know if I am native speaker because I have always been wondering that. Euskaldun, which means Basque speaker, is someone who knows Basque. The word itself means that. Basque owner. I don't know. I think I'm Euskaldun, period. What is fascinating here is that despite it having the local variety, being fluent in the language, being also fluent in Spanish, it is his heritage that precludes him from calling himself a native speaker. So over here, he seems that his authenticity is being put into question, at least for himself, right? And instead he says, you know what, I am just in the middle. He also doesn't consider himself a second language speaker, even if he learned the language mainly through the school and then through socialization in the town. But it's something that also marks him as something in the middle, which is potentially, or at least we could potentially assume that it could be the variety and the fact that he can live his life in Basque, especially because he lives in a zone 3 bilingualism area. Let me introduce you to Eneritz, who at the time when I was interviewing her, she was in one of the schoolings. She was staying in the Barnetegi in Zornotza, and she felt a little bit ashamed of her fluency. And this is what she says. Now I speak Basque badly. My husband is Euskaldun. You better believe it. So Euskaldun in this context means that he's a speaker of Basque. And with him, never. So I speak English, I speak sign language, and well, for instance, Italian, I speak it badly, but I'm calm, I speak it. But Basque is different. I feel a lot of pressure. So over here, we see that there is a disjoint between feeling Basque and speaking Basque. And that there is a pressure that she's basically adhering to. So I asked, what is that pressure? And she said, and on top of that, I am an independentist. Just imagine, it embarrasses me. Yeah. It embarrasses me not to know Basque. And on top of that, people think I'm Euskaldun. So it is my obstacle. It is here in my head. It is a psychological problem. So basically, this disjunction comes with the idea that in order for you to be considered an authentic Basque, she has the ideals of that independentism. Not that everybody has them, but for her, that seems to be important. And Basque comes with it. Not only Basque, but also certain proficiency in Basque. She's also not necessarily a Basque user because she doesn't seem to have the fluency. Although she's trying to achieve that, she still has that pressure that for her does not apply to Italian, given her identity. So what is the point of all these 3 different people? Is that being a speaker of Basque has different connotations and different people would use different labels. So what are those labels? So it is believed, or it has been argued, that in fact, Basque people are going to be considered themselves, they're going to situate themselves in a continuum of how authentic they seem. And authenticity comes with a sense of pride and legitimacy. What does that mean? That in order for me to be considered a legitimate speaker of Basque, I also need to be considered myself authentic. And what is that going to give you? Well, those who consider themselves Euskaldunsar, which it kind of means old Basque, but this would mean native speaker, they usually use regional varieties. So the indexical value here, or the assumption here, is that if you speak a regional variety, is because you probably learned it at home. This contrasts with the least authentic of all, which are the new speakers, because they're associated with the standard. And that standard is going to give you away that the fact that you learned the language in the school. So if you learn in school, that means that you do not come from the past. And then you have those in the middle that they say, I'm neither new, I'm neither old, right? Meaning that all these assumptions that the society have as to whether you have Basque parents or not, whether you are an independentist or not, right? It could be seen in the middle. What is interesting about this is that you can actually change categories. This is not for life necessarily. So we are seeing that some people that start considering themselves a new speaker, they're starting to claim the category of being Basque or Basque speaker. What does that mean? That they're basically saying in an implicit way, I am more authentic. And what is it that they do in order to be authentic? Well, they may expand social networks. This was the case of Danny, for instance. Adopting a regional variety. This was the case of my parents, for instance. moving or job changes, they could actually activate your speakerhood. Or in some other cases, research has shown that new speakers, especially those from Bilbao, they're starting to provide, they're making a colloquial standard Basque. Itxaso was a case in which he was trying to put some Spanish in order to also make his standard Basque, which was considered artificial, a little bit more cool, but then he will be criticized for it by using certain words in Spanish, for instance. So now I'm interested in showing you a little bit of the Basque grammar. So Basque is considered a language isolate. That doesn't mean that we live in isolation. In fact, it means that we have no genetic relationship with any other language that we know. It's considered a subject-object-verb language, which means that the verb tends to go, and I say tends because it's not all or nothing. There's always variation. We have a very rich case system. What that means is that these little markers over here are going to be telling us who is doing what to whom. And these are also considered postpositions because they come post the word and not prepositions like Romance languages have. So for instance, here the sentence Nik, Aneri, Musua, Eman, Diot basically means I to Anne, kiss, give, I have, right? So I gave a kiss to Anne. So one of the salient features of Basque has been, there are a lot of stereotypes behind that it's a difficult language. Well, many people learn it. My parents are very, very, very fluent in the language, right? That we have very, very rich morphology. What is interesting is that this rich morphology is also going to give us a chance to understand the social dynamics of the language. So one of the key characteristics or unique characteristics of the Basque language, at least within the European context, has been used the ergative case marker, which is over here. I want to make it clear that there are actually more languages with this system than not. But within the European context, this is something that becomes very, very salient. So how is it that learners need to learn how to put this little K? So it would depend on the kind of verb. So for instance, if you want to say that you want to watch TV, what you're going to do is that you're going to have the I, which means ni, and then you'll have the K over here. Other verbs, such as, or more active verbs, or we call them anergative, right? They're also going to require this K. But then there's another subset of verbs that we call them an accusative. These are considered ones that might be, less active of some sort, right? Although we can talk about this. I know, Julio, you're probably thinking, what kind of syntax is this? But basically, these kind of verbs are not going to have this K marker over here. So instead, we're going to say ni etorri naiz, and we're going to have a different kind of conjugation of the verb. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the subject of when I say I, right? If I'm doing something to somebody, if I'm watching TV, or if I'm skiing and so forth, right? We need to put that little marker. Whereas if there are certain verbs such as to come, or for instance, to go and things like that, these do not require that little K, so we don't mark it at all. However, like language is going to have a lot of variation. So what does that mean? Is that sometimes we forget to put it, right? And sometimes we put it when we're not supposed to put it, right? So the question is, how is it that language, a different kind of speakers use this? What is interesting is that this is extremely chastised. This is a Facebook post by a very frustrated teacher who was grading exams and basically made 2 columns of those who call them, in favor of ergativity. So apparently 26% of these written exams basically have full ergativity, whereas the rest are considered ergative suiciders, right? And the other ones are called ergative holders. So this is what the post basically says. I have graded 139 exams. In 102 of them, at least there is an omission. The rest, I will keep them in the sanctuary. Bye-bye, hashtag bye-bye ergativity, hashtag language change. So over here, the implication is that hearing Basque or using Basque, at least in the written system, is going to be a miracle, that you put them in the sanctuary, and that the ergative case marker is actually being lost. This is at least the perception is given. And then the question is, why is it that they are referring to this idea of the sanctuary? In fact, this is making a link to a joke that is very common within the Basque country through the comic series of Saldiero. So this is where we have the sanctuary, which is the sanctuary of Irati. This is where supposedly Basque started, right? So over here we have these images of Yoda, right? talking about that they found new text, right? So over here, I want to read this. I translated this in English for you.
Yeah. So,
all right, so let's go back to Guernica, my lovely town. This Guernica is also known from Picasso's painting. And it has about 16,000 people. At the time where I recorded these people, it was 16,500. So very stable population. Something very interesting about this town is that in the 60s, we also had a huge population from different parts of Spain, from Castilla, especially Castilla-León and Andalusia, right? But today it's considered as zone 3 bilingualism, meaning that 80% of the population speaks the language regularly, both languages, Basque and Spanish. So we're using these people to understand whether the ergative case marker is actually changing. So how do we do that? In social linguistics, we need to look at how the grammar of Basque ergativity is working and then compare it to the different social dynamics of the time. We call these social factors. So linguistic factors, basically, we need to mark whether they're going to use it with the verbs such as watch the TV. This is our transitive verb, a negative, whether it's skiing or whether you have come and so forth. Because the K is such a special, marker, right? It's a K that sometimes when you're speaking quite fast, at the end of the word, you might sometimes omit it, or maybe you are just going to say, if you have two Ks together, right, one of them might be dropped. So for instance, nik carrera egin dut, right? So nik carrera, right? Sometimes one of them might drop and so forth. This is what we mean by phonological context. It's important that we know what segment comes after to see whether the K is being pronounced or not. Animacy and person. This means whether the subject is one person, so first person. So for instance, if I did it, if you did it, if third person did it, and so forth. And then whether the subject is considered a pronoun such as I, a name, Itxaso, or an MP, for instance, the girl, and so forth. So we're going to look at how ergativity is being used in this. Where is the variation behind it? With respect to social factors, we're interested whether young people are doing different things. We're also looking at male and female because it is believed that women tend to sound more standard, meaning that they tend to do, basically they sound more standard, so that means that ergativity will be more used with them, supposedly. And then language use is very important given the bilingualism, right? So over here, we ask them how much Basque they use on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 meaning they use Basque all the time, 1 meaning that they never use it. In this town, most of the speakers, they were a range of between 2. There were some people that would use it less, and some other people that would use it a lot or all the time. So, but never 100% Basque. There is always going to be some sort of bilingualism. So we are interested whether if you use more Basque, you're also going to be using more ergativity. And let's just start looking at the results. So over here, these box blocks and these little dots represent one speaker or each speaker. These are the means of the variation. And then here we have our older speakers and here we have our younger speakers. So the older speakers are the ones that did not go to school in Basque. They don't know how to read and write in Basque, but they speak the language. Whereas the younger speakers are the ones that are actually both speakers and also literate in the language. So one of the things that we actually see is that nobody's using ergativity 100%. This is normal and common. However, one of the things that we notice is that ergativity is being used as expected with the verbs that they are supposed to be doing it, with transitives such as I saw the TV, and an ergative such as skiing, right? And this is consistent, actually, both in the older and in the younger. And then one of the things that we see is that they might sometimes use it a little bit with verbs that they shouldn't be using it, such as to come. But this is very, 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 very little. What we see is that contrary to the laws, in fact, younger speakers are actually using it more than the older speakers. One of the suggestions that we have for this is, in fact, that the school system is making a stabilization of this ergative, right? So contrary to the teacher's belief, in fact, younger speakers are using it more. So is ergative changing? Sure, it could be changing, but in fact, it's changing towards at least the stabilization through the schooling. However, when you ask other speakers, this person is from Bilbao, right? And another Basque teacher himself, and he says new speakers have a problem with respect to the notion of transitivity and intransitivity. This means the verb. That is, sometimes they will say nik, nice, or ni egin dut. So he's saying that it's actually the new speakers that are changing the language and so forth. So for that, we are going to ask the question, are new speakers really changing Basque activity? And for that, we have to go to the literature of language acquisition as well. The general claim is that the acquisition of social linguistic variation tends to be particularly difficult for new speakers or for to learn. This is because social linguistic competence involves a lot of things. One, the relative frequency of whether they're using the ergative or not. So they have to be attuned as to what native speakers are doing in order to be able to get those domains. So that means that if native speakers are using 90% of the ergative, they have to be attuned to those kind of statistics. Now, these frameworks, however, are unfortunately assuming that they need to sound like native speakers, because those are the ones that are going to be considered more authentic of some sort. And remember that not all new speakers want to sound like them. However, for the purpose of this study, we're going to compare the production. These speakers also have to learn independent linguistic and social factors. What does that mean? They need to know which verbs they should use it with, whether it's a pronoun and not so forth, right? And these are things that usually are not taught. This is something that you have to be attuned to. And then whether the ordering of those factors is going to tell us whether the grammar is actually the same or not. And then social and lexical relations, it means that the stereotypes that exist behind that they also have to learn about it. So we're going to be looking at whether, how is it that people from Guernica and people from Bilbao are actually doing the same thing. So Bilbao is slightly different. The main difference is that it's considered a non-traditional Basque-speaking zone. But of course, Basque is spoken thanks to the revitalization. The variety that we're going to hear here is mostly a standard Basque. So there are going to be speakers and writers of a standard Basque. What is interesting is that it's also much bigger, and the population of different parts of Spain also was much larger, although proportionally the same as Guernica. This is why these two towns are actually very comparable with that respect. And here you have two beautiful pictures of Bilbao. So another important aspect, social aspect that we wanted to ask to people in Bilbao is that what kind of a speaker do you consider yourself? And most of them said, I am a new speaker. But there were some people that said, you know what, I'm past that, I'm better than that. Basically saying, I'm a Basque speaker, I own my language, I use my language, and so forth. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask is whether the language used also affected the use of Basque activity. This comes from theories of usage-based approaches, which basically say that if you are the more you use the language, and this is how grammar is going to be kind of constructed, right? That's the assumption behind that. We also know that language use as a frequency might not be the only determinant. In other parts, you can also look at whether certain expressions are going to be more common and so forth. So according to this model, language acquisition is going to be driven by matching patterns in the speech that we hear. What that means is that we automatically become attuned to the statistical distribution of how people speak. So that means that learning occurs from a probabilistic manner. This suggests that more frequent forms will be acquired first. So this is a hypothesis that we can actually test by looking at the verb frequency, or this is what is called lexical frequency. So that means that verbs that are more frequent are going to require, that are also going to require ergativity, are going to be used with ergativity first, right? That would be the hypothesis behind that. But then here we have to make the decision, what is frequent, what is considered a frequent verb. So Erker and Guy determined that 1% of the entire data is enough to make it considered a lexical frequency. So based on this corpus that I created, which has about 2,700 sentences that are being considered for analysis here, is that if the verb appears 28 times, this means that this verb is considered frequent. And that means that participants are going to learn these verbs first with the ergative. That would be the hypothesis. So let's start looking at the distribution. So over here, we have our transitive verbs. So this would be the I watched the TV, I skied, and then I came, right? And here we have our three groups. So remember, the traditional are the ones from Guernica that we just talked about, right? That they maintain this system as it has been described. Young people are stabilizing more. Now, the new speakers are going to be here. These are from Bilbao, and then these are the Basque speakers, also from Bilbao. And one of the things that we notice, let's look at new speakers. So new speakers are the ones that are showing the most variation. Some of them only put it at 20 or 30%, and some others are almost reaching near 100% on some sort, right? And they are actually consistent with the verbs with which they can put it. So what we see here is that even if they don't put it all the time, they know the grammar behind it, because they know that if I have to put a K, I have to put it with the verb to see or to watch, to ski, and not with the verb to come. When we compare with those people that consider themselves Basque, one of the things that we notice is that, in fact, they are matching the traditional speakers, right? They're basically sounding like them. When we look at the grammar, this is the graphs. So, this is the table in which means these are the different linguistic factors. How do we interpret this data? This data means that if this is the linguistic factors that are going to be affecting each of the three groups. What that means is that if they share these different linguistic factors, that means that they share the grammar behind them. So one of the things that we notice first is that new speakers have actually a more complex variation with respect to that, because there are more linguistic factors that are going to be affecting the use of Basque, right? This oftentimes in the language literature has been interpreted as that they are restructuring or figuring out how to get the grammar. However, it's actually consistent with how native speakers and Basque speakers are doing it. The second thing that we see here in red means the lexical frequency effects. And in red, it means that those lexical frequency effects were there. What does that mean? It means that those verbs that actually have the ergative case marker are learned first in certain phonological contexts. And what is that phonological context? If the next vowel is, for instance, if the next word is actually a vowel. So the type of MP also matters. So pronouns, for instance, are learned faster. Why? Because they also come with certain verbs. So certain verbs that have certain pronouns are going to have the ergative first. What does this all tell us? What this tells us is that new speakers are paying attention to what traditional speakers are actually using. They are very, very attuned to those frequency effects, even at the subconscious level. And that is what is guiding their acquisition process as well. Notice that frequency effects do not necessarily matter to the traditional speaker itself. And there is a social factor that does not appear in the standard Basque speakers from Bilbao. So social variation does not necessarily matter over there. So how can we interpret some of these results? When they are omitting this ergative case marker, right? Are they doing it all wrong? When we actually look at the so-called mistakes, there are not that many mistakes. Why? Because they do have some pragmatic effects that are happening. So for instance, sometimes when they're introducing a new subject, the ergative does not need to appear. For instance, here they would say, Ortega Cano, tipo bat ilban accidente baten. Ortega Cano, he killed a dude in an accident, right? So over here, the subject, this is called hanging subject and so forth. So these ones are not going to appear with them, with the ergative per se. And actually, new speakers are attuned to these kind of effects. When we look at the reverse, we also see that sometimes when the ergative appears when it's not supposed to appear, is for emphatic or topicalization purposes, right? And of course, this happens very, very little, but it's consistent throughout the Basque country. What does this mean? It means that new speakers are also imitating or adding to this kind of variation, but is more varied than those in Guernica. So in summary, language use was also not a predictor for new speakers, and lexical frequency is guiding the acquisition for new speakers. So are new speakers changing Basque ergativity? Sure, those who speak to traditional speakers sound like them, meaning that those who consider themselves Basque speakers and authentic Basque speakers are picking more on that. So there is no evidence that Basque ergativity is actually dying out at all, right? In fact, it's the opposite. The more you speak with other people, the more you're going to use. So now let's talk a little bit about the stereotypes. What is the social meaning of Basque ergativity? What do people think about this? The stereotypes that the teacher has, where do they come from? And also what Iñaki told us. So for that, I did what is considered, I did an experiment, a social experiment. It's a match guys experiment. What is it that, well, I recorded a friend of mine reading a little text, and I will let you hear it right now in 4 different versions. So for instance, speaking in the original with all the ergatives, speaking in the original, but I omitted all the ergatives, and then I have her do it again with the ergative, with all the case, and then in the standard Basque, removing all the Ks, right? And this is what it sounded in a standard Basque without the K. So this will be considered bad or wrong.
Larumatean, egun ona egiten zuen, eta naia eta ni pentsatu genuen mendira joatea. Egun osoa kanpoan emango genuelez, bakoitza zerbait ekarri behar zuen jateko. Ni entsalada ekarri nuen, eta naia okela frijitua. 4 ordu ibilita gero, mahai bat aurkitu genuen, eta jaten hasi ginen. Baserri ondoko handera irten zuen, eta esan zigun laizter etxera joateko, euri hasiko zela. Orduan, dena batu genuen, eta etxera joan ginen.
Okay, so what is interesting is that they heard this person 4 times, but in different times in the experiment, so they wouldn't recognize that it was the same person. They didn't know it was the same person. So after hearing each time in different instances, I had them fill out a questionnaire where I asked questions such as, does this person sound traditional or new, native speaker or second language speaker? Is this person authentic or not? Does this person make mistakes or not? And basically, they just have to fill it out. Basically, I'm having them judge the person based on the language that they hear without them knowing that they are judging the same person. So because it's the same person, we can actually see that if there are any effects, it's not because of the person, it's because of the language and the stereotypes associated behind that. So let's look at the results. So over here, let's look at, these are the people, the new speaker group, the Euskaldun or the Basque group. And so these 2 groups are from Bilbao, and this group is from Guernica. And then here we have our 4 guises. This means Guernica Basque without the ergative, Guernica Basque with the ergative, standard Basque without, so no ergative, and a standard Basque with the ergative. The first thing that we can see for the questions, does this person sound new or traditional? The 2 guises or the 2 texts, right, that were in the regional variety, this was associated with traditional. And then the 2 standard varieties or the 2 standard guises, when I say guises, I mean in the little text, right? The 2 little texts, they're associated with sounding like a new speaker. But people from Bilbao, it didn't matter whether they use the ergative or not. You are traditional if you speak the variety, you are new if you speak the standard. However, people from Guernica, those traditional ones, they say, wait a minute, when ergative is being omitted in the standard, this person is considered even new speaker, right? However, if you omit the ergative in your regional variety, you're still traditional. Don't worry, right? There is no effect over there. So what is interesting here is that people from Guernica are starting to notice that when you are not putting the K, when you're speaking standard, you're going to be considered a more new speaker. Now we're interested whether there is issues with authenticity. And one of the things that we notice is that for those in Bilbao, if you speak the regional variety, you're going to be considered more authentic. If you speak the standard variety, you're still authentic, but less, right? And ergativity does not give you any chance. It doesn't matter. You put the ergative or not. What makes you authentic is the regional variety. But if you are in Guernica and you speak the regional variety, right? Over here, they're starting to notice that, in fact, if you don't use the ergative case marker in the standard Basque, you're also considered less authentic, right? So now we have 3 layers. We have the most authentic of all is speaking in the regional variety. Then you have a standard Basque, but you better put your ergatives, right? And you will still be considered less authentic, less Basque, right? But you still consider authentic. And then if you drop your case when you're speaking the standard, you're doomed, basically. You're going to be considered the worst of the worst. I mean, not Basque at all in this respect. However, notice that here, if you omit your ergatives in Guernica, in your regional variety, don't worry, you're still authentic. What does that mean? That if you're going to make a mistake, it better not be in standard. That means that the standard mistakes are becoming more salient and making you a lot more authentic, meaning that the variety that you speak is going to determine whether you are allowed to drop the K or not. But that's only in Guernica. People from Bilbao do not care about that. And then finally, does this person make mistakes? What is interesting, because I thought, maybe people in Guernica are not noticing that the person from Guernica is not omitting the ergative. And they're like, no, they're noticing. Hey, people in Guernica sometimes drop the K, but because they speak the regional variety, don't worry, they're still authentic enough. But they're in fact more authentic than the standard Basque speakers who put the ergatives, right? So What is interesting also in Bilbao, those people in people that consider themselves as Kandun in a standard Basque, yeah, that's a mistake, but it's not gonna make you less authentic than the other ones. Give us a break, right? That's basically what they're trying to say. And then the new speakers say it doesn't matter, just use the damn Basque and you will be good, right? It doesn't matter. So one of the questions that also comes here is that whether they're noticing the ergative marker is being put or not. And Patricia, who's the new speaker, would say, oh, that K. When we learned, it was called ergative. All right, it's the ergative, right? But in the beginning, you forget to put the K. Damn, that is to be K, right? So there is not necessarily that much awareness in the beginning, but it's reinforced in the school system. But then another speaker would say how she felt about being corrected. So over here we have, but then another, I don't know what I was saying. And then he said, damn. So let me give you a little bit of context behind this one. They were partying in a town where regional Basque is spoken, similar to Guernica, right? And apparently she was corrected and she was kind of annoyed. And this was 6 in the morning already after partying and stuff like that. So she was being told, damn, yeah, irunek, told me, right? And all of them, I mean, the cousin and others started laughing. That's not how you say it. I know the Basque is not my first language, but people destroy you. But is it normal, right, man? And then I went there and I was like, angry face and in shock a little. Well, I was like mad. And then I left very mad at 6:30. At 6:30 in the morning, my friend asked, what's going on? And then she responded, you know what, Miriam, I'm fucking sick and tired of being told that I'm not a real Basque. Go fuck yourselves. Take your town up your ass, right? So what we see here is this frustration. So do the new speakers know about ergativity? They do. Frequency effects is helping them achieve that, right? And they're also aware of the stereotypes behind them, but they do not necessarily adhere to them. So what are some summary points that we can draw from here? There is no evidence of loss of the ergative case system in the presumed apparent time. Apparent time means that we compare the older with the younger people, right? New speakers are not failing to acquire it. They're showing more variation, but they are starting to adjust to the grammar, restructuring the grammar behind that. So what exactly is changing? What is changing is the formal education is helping to stabilize the variation, and the introduction of a new standard is creating new stereotypes because of the new identities that have emerged. So what that means is that social factors in the structural variation of Basque are in fact a reflection of the social changes. And in fact, new speakers are also contributing to the stereotypes that might be existing in there. In fact, as they progress in the language use, they might pick on more stereotypes, but they themselves do not necessarily adhere to them, meaning that they are aware of them, but they do not necessarily become as mean as the other ones. So what are some conclusions that we can draw from here? We know that the language variety that one speaks modulates the social meaning, whether you can put the ergative or not. This means that not all varieties and languages are going to be valued equally. You need to obtain some kind of social capital. This is the work of Pierre Bourdieu with respect to social capital that was implemented by Catherine Wooler in minority language context. And one of the things that she says is that in this context, multiple and alternative linguistic capitals actually are colliding. In this case, in the Basque country, we have the standard and the regional variety that are starting to collide, and social meaning is going to be different from the ergative according to that. So what would be the symbolic capital in the Basque country? What does it mean to be a competent Basque speaker in the Basque country? It means that you need to know a regional variety. It means that you need to know how to read and write in the standard Basque at least. It means that you need to be multilingual with at least the language of the state. And although we didn't talk about it, it potentially mean that you need to also speak another global language such as English. So there are multiple implications that we can draw from here, but I'm gonna stop here and leave just potential things that we can do in the classroom or in the area, and we can open the discussion for questions. I see Julio coming up, so it's time for me to shut up. That es que ricasco.